I still remember the exact words my mother-in-law said to me the first time she really looked at me after my wedding. She smiled that cold, polite smile and said, "It is good that you know how to stay home now. Some women are not built for anything more." She said it like it was a compliment, but it felt like a sentence. Because in that house, after my marriage, I was no longer a woman with a name, a career, a mind, or a future. I was just the daughter-in-law, just the wife, just the housewife. At least, that is what they thought. They had no idea that while they were judging me for washing dishes, making coffee, folding laundry, and keeping quiet at family dinners, I was also running a business that had clients in 3 states, 2 time zones, and one very important boardroom that would soon decide the fate of the same family that had been laughing at me. And when the day came for them to finally learn who I really was, I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I did not beg them to respect me. I simply walked into the room with the truth. And that truth was enough to break every bit of pride they had built their lives on. My name is Elena, and this is the story of how they tried to bury me as a housewife, only to realize too late that I was the woman holding everything together. When I got married, I did not move into a warm, welcoming home. I moved into a house that felt like a museum of control. Everything had rules. How the towels were folded, how the tea was served, what time dinner had to be ready, which dishes my husband's mother preferred, how long I could speak before being told I was talking too much. My husband, Daniel, was not cruel in the beginning. That would have been easier to fight. No, he was worse than cruel. He was passive. He let his mother speak for him. He let his silence do the damage. If I cooked something simple, they said I had no class. If I cooked something fancy, they said I was wasting time trying to impress people. If I cleaned the house, nobody noticed. If I missed one thing, they noticed immediately. Every day in that house felt like I was being measured by standards nobody had ever intended me to meet. And the worst part was that I let them think I had nothing else going on. I let them think I was only home all day. I let them believe I had become small. Because the truth was, I had learned a long time ago that some people do not respect your strength when they can see it. So sometimes, you let them underestimate you until the moment matters. Before marriage, I was not just working. I had built something from the ground up. I started as a freelance brand strategist after college, working from my apartment with a used laptop and a cracked phone screen. I answered emails late at night. I took calls in coffee shops. I designed campaigns, built websites, wrote launch plans, and helped small businesses grow when nobody else would take them seriously. At first, it was just survival. Then it became skill. Then it became a company. By the time I got engaged, I had a quiet but successful business with a small team, long-term clients, and revenue that would have shocked anyone who still thought of me as just a girl with a laptop. But I made one choice after marriage. I didn't shut it down. I hid it, not because I was ashamed, because I was tired. Tired of proving myself. Tired of being questioned. Tired of people turning every success into a debate about whether I was neglecting my duties as a wife. So I changed the structure of my business. I moved everything remote. I let my team lead most public meetings. I used a separate office email. I signed documents after midnight. I handled clients from the guest room and the laundry room and the car while waiting outside the grocery store. And in the house, I became invisible. That was the plan. Until Daniel's family made a very big mistake. It started with money. Of course it did. My father-in-law, Richard, had always acted like a man who believed respect was something he was owed just because he wore an expensive watch and spoke loudly in restaurants. He owned a mid-sized logistics company that had grown fast in the early years and then started slowing down. At first, nobody spoke about it. Then came the missed payments. Then the delayed vendor checks. Then the meetings that turned into arguments behind closed doors. I heard pieces of it, of course. A secretary being told to hold off on a call. A cousin mentioning there had been some issues. My husband's family had the kind of pride that made them lie to themselves longer than they should. They kept saying everything was fine. Then one evening at dinner, the truth slipped through the cracks. Richard put his fork down and said, "We have a problem with the new expansion. The bank is being difficult." My mother-in-law, Margaret, frowned. Difficult how? Difficult as in, they want updated financial projections, stronger collateral, and more proof of operational stability. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That sounds manageable. Richard gave a sharp laugh. It would be, if the numbers looked better. Nobody spoke after that. Then Margaret did what she always did when the room got tense. She looked at me, as if somehow my silence was easier to blame than their failure. Well, she said, at least Elena has been good at making the home peaceful. Not everyone needs a career to be useful. She smiled when she said it. That smile again. The one that made cruelty look like manners. Daniel did not stop her. He just looked down at his plate. I remember the sound of the ice in my water glass. I remember the clock on the wall. I remember how small the room felt, even though the dining table was large enough for 10. I looked at Margaret and I said, very calmly, yes. Some people build a home. Some people build a business. Both take work. She gave a tiny, dismissive nod, as if I had said something charmingly naive. Oh, Elena, she said, don't compare household chores to real work. That was the moment I stopped feeling hurt. Not because I wasn't hurt, because something colder had taken its place. I had been patient. I had been quiet. I had let them believe my life had shrunk just because I chose peace. But there is a difference between humility and humiliation. And I had reached my limit. The next morning, I got an email from my team. One of our biggest clients had referred us to another company. That company turned out to be the same one Richard's firm was trying to partner with for the expansion. I opened the email, read the name, and stared at the screen for a long second. Then I sat back in my chair and exhaled, because suddenly, the situation changed. Not for them. For me. The company they needed was mine, and nobody in that house knew it yet. For the next 3 days, I said nothing. I kept making breakfast. I kept folding the laundry. I kept smiling politely when Margaret asked if I had remembered to defrost the chicken. I kept my voice soft and my expression calm. But behind the scenes, I was reading contracts, reviewing terms, and speaking with my legal team. The company Richard wanted to partner with was one of our long-standing clients. They had come to us because they needed a strategic outreach campaign, better digital positioning, and a stronger public image before the partnership deal was finalized. The executives wanted a meeting. They wanted to discuss branding, visibility, and market trust. And because I was the founder, I was invited. The irony was almost too perfect. I did not tell Daniel immediately. I wanted to see how far the house could go on pride alone. That Friday, Margaret invited the whole family for dinner. She had guests coming too. 2 cousins, 1 aunt, and a family friend who liked to talk too much about successful women as long as they were not in his house. I knew what was coming before it even started. The comments began as soon as everyone sat down. Some women are just naturally better at family life, Margaret said, glancing at me over her glass. One day you'll understand, said the aunt. A woman's real success is in how she supports her husband. The cousin laughed and said, exactly. Not everyone needs to chase big ambitions. I sat there, quiet, picking at my food. Then Richard, who had clearly had too much wine and too little sense, leaned back and said, honestly, it is a blessing when a woman accepts her place. No stress, no pressure, no competition. There it was again. That word, place. As if my life had been assigned to me by people who had never bothered to learn my name properly. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but not enough. That was always the problem. He was never brave enough to defend me, but never honest enough to leave me alone either. Then Margaret turned to me and said, Elena, Maybe you can help in the way you know best. We need someone to organize the home for the investors' dinner next week. Since you are free, that would be useful. Free. I almost laughed. Instead, I set my fork down and looked at her. I'm not free next week, I said. The table went quiet. She blinked. Excuse me? I said I'm not free. Richard gave a short, amused snort. And what exactly are you busy with? I met his eyes and answered. A client meeting. Margaret tilted her head, confused and faintly annoyed. What client meeting? Now Daniel looked up. I could see it in his face. He thought this was a small thing, some side hobby, some little project I could mention, and then drop. So I said, the meeting with Harlow and Finch. That changed the room. Richard straightened. Margaret stopped smiling. Daniel's fork froze halfway to his plate. Everyone at that table had heard of Harlow and Finch. It was the company they had spent weeks trying to impress. The company Richard's firm was begging to partner with. The company whose executives were scheduled to meet his team the following Tuesday. Richard stared at me. What did you say? I said I have a meeting with Harlow and Finch. He let out a dry laugh, but it sounded forced. And how would you have a meeting with them? Because now, for the first time, the room was asking the right question. I looked at him and said, because I founded the consulting agency they hired. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the air felt stunned. Margaret frowned. You founded it? Yes. Daniel looked at me like I had spoken in a language he had never expected me to know. Richard barked a laugh, but it was the laugh of a man already losing control. Come on now. Don't be ridiculous. I reached into my bag, took out my phone and placed it on the table. Then I opened the email. The company logo was right there. The meeting invite. My name. My title. Founder and Chief Strategy Officer. I held the phone up just enough for everyone to see. Silence. That kind of silence is powerful. It is the sound of pride breaking in real time. Margaret's face changed first. Confusion. Then disbelief, then something close to panic. Richard's jaw tightened. Daniel looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. You never said anything, he finally muttered. I looked at him and answered softly, you never asked. That one sentence landed harder than any argument could have. Because it was true. He had never asked what I did late at night. He had never asked why I was always awake after everyone else went to sleep. He had never asked where the extra income in our household account came from. He had been comfortable assuming I was small because that made him feel large. Margaret found her voice again, but it sounded thin now. Still, Elena, that is very unusual. Why keep this hidden? I smiled, but not kindly, because every time I succeeded at something, I was made to feel like I had done something wrong. That quieted her. I kept going. When I earned my first major client, I was told I was too ambitious. When I hired my first employee, I was asked who would take care of the home. When I signed a contract for a 6-figure deal, I was told not to let it get to my head. When I worked late, I was called distracted. When I stayed quiet, I was called unimportant. I looked around the table. So, I chose peace. I let you believe what made you comfortable. Richard folded his arms, trying to recover his authority. And what exactly are you saying now? I leaned forward slightly and said, I'm saying that the partner you need for your expansion is also the woman you have been belittling for months. That hit him hard, because now the humiliation was not personal. It was financial. It was public. It was strategic. And Richard understood that immediately. He asked, can you influence the deal? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I don't need to influence the deal. I already lead the team presenting it. Daniel looked stunned. You're running the presentation? Yes. He swallowed. Why didn't you tell me? That question. That one was the most painful of all. Not because I didn't expect it. Because I had spent months asking myself the same thing about him. Why didn't he ask? Why didn't he care? Why did he let his mother speak to me like this? Why did he enjoy the comfort of my silence but never protect it? I answered him honestly. Because you liked me more when you thought I needed you. His face changed. For the first time, he had no polished reply, no defense, no easy excuse. The family friend cleared his throat and stared down at his plate. The cousin suddenly found his phone fascinating. Nobody wanted to speak now, because the woman they had mocked as a housewife was the same woman whose signature could help save the family business. And they knew it. The next Tuesday, I put on a dress, simple jewelry, and the kind of calm expression that comes from knowing exactly who you are. No dramatic makeup, no loud entrance, just me. I arrived at the corporate office at 8:45 a.m. Richard was already there with Daniel and two executives from his company. They were all wearing nervous smiles, pretending they were in control. Then I walked into the conference room. The executive team stood up to greet me. "Good morning, Elena," one of them said warmly. Richard looked from them to me like the floor had shifted beneath him. One of the executives extended a hand. "We've heard excellent things about your strategy work." I nodded and said, "Thank you. Let's get started." That meeting lasted 43 minutes. 43 minutes of calm, clear presentation. 43 minutes of data, growth projections, consumer insights, branding solutions, and market positioning. 43 minutes in which I spoke like someone who knew exactly what she had built. And when I finished, the room was still. Then the lead executive smiled and said, "This is exactly the kind of leadership we were hoping to work with." He turned to Richard. "Your company's future looks promising, but Elena's team is the reason we're moving forward." I didn't glance at Richard right away. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of his silence. The same silence he had once used against me. Now it was his. After the meeting, as people gathered their papers and stood to leave, Richard approached me in the hallway. His face looked older somehow. Not because of age, because pride had a way of aging people instantly when it cracked. "Elena," he said, low and careful now, "I underestimated you." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. "You did." He nodded slowly. "I suppose I should apologize." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "You should, but not because I'm useful now, because I was always worthy of respect." He swallowed hard. And for once he had nothing clever to say. That evening when I got home, Daniel was waiting in the living room. He stood up the moment I walked in. "I need to talk to you," he said. I set my bag down. He looked nervous, which was new for him. Men like Daniel are often most uncomfortable when the woman they underestimated no longer needs their approval. "I should have defended you," he said. "I said nothing. I should have asked more questions. I should have paid attention. I should have known you were carrying so much without telling me." I crossed my arms. Not angry, just guarded. "And yet you didn't." He nodded. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." There was a long pause. Then he added, "I think I liked feeling like I understood our marriage, but I didn't understand you at all." That was the closest thing to honesty I had heard from him in a long time. I looked at him for a while before speaking. "I didn't hide my success to deceive you," I said. "I hid it because I was tired of being punished for being more than you expected." His eyes dropped. "And maybe," I continued, "I kept it hidden because I wanted to know whether you loved me or the version of me that made you feel in control." That one hurt him. I could see it. Good. Sometimes truth hurts before it heals. Over the next few weeks, things changed. Not perfectly. Not magically. This is not one of those stories where everybody claps, apologizes, and becomes better overnight. Margaret was awkward around me. Richard became unusually polite. The cousin stopped making jokes. The family friend no longer talked about a woman's place when I entered the room. And Daniel had to work harder than he ever had before, because respect is not restored by one apology. It is rebuilt through behavior. He started asking about my work. really asking. He started listening when I talked about deadlines, strategy meetings, and team hires. He stopped interrupting me. He stopped answering for me. And for the first time since our marriage, he saw me as a full human being, not just a role. But the most important change happened inside me. Because once you have watched people underestimate you, and then watch the truth unfold, something shifts. You stop shrinking. You stop apologizing for your power. You stop mistaking silence for surrender. I no longer walked through that house like a guest, trying not to upset anyone. I walked through it like someone who belonged to herself. And that changed everything. A few months later, Harlow and Finch signed the full partnership agreement with Richard's company. Not because I saved him out of pity. Because the work was good. Because the numbers made sense. Because the plan was solid. That mattered to me. I did not want to win through revenge. I wanted to win through excellence. That is the thing people often misunderstand about women like me. They think our strength is loud. Sometimes it is. But more often it is quiet. It is the woman who keeps going when nobody applauds. It is the wife who builds a life behind the scenes. It is the daughter-in-law who is dismissed in the kitchen and then walks into a room full of men and changes the future. It is not always about shouting. A few days after that meeting, I thought the story was over. I thought the worst part was already behind me. I was wrong. Because pride does not die in one afternoon. It bleeds slowly. It twists. It looks for ways to survive. And in that house, the biggest wound was not the fact that they had underestimated me. The biggest wound was that they could no longer pretend they had power over me. For the first time, when I entered the kitchen, the silence felt different. Not warm, not respectful, awkward, careful, as if everyone was now afraid to say the wrong thing. Margaret did not speak to me for almost 2 days. Richard barely looked at me. Even the maid, who used to ignore my presence because everyone else did, now greeted me nervously every morning, as if I had suddenly become important in a way she had not been prepared for. But I was not interested in their discomfort. I was interested in the truth. And the truth was, my marriage had been built on a terrible foundation. Not because Daniel was evil. Not because his mother was always cruel. But because the entire family had been trained to value appearances more than honesty. They liked the idea of family. They did not understand the work of one. That night, Daniel came to the bedroom late. He stood near the doorway for a long time before speaking. "I talked to my father," he said. "I was sitting on the edge of the bed, reading reports on my tablet. I looked up. And he said he was ashamed. I almost smiled, but not because I believed the apology had solved anything. I smiled because shame had finally entered a house that had survived too long on arrogance. Daniel stepped closer. He said he should have treated you differently from the beginning. I closed my tablet. "That is true." He nodded once. "I know." There was a long silence. Then he sat down in the chair across from me, not on the bed. That small detail mattered. He was finally acting like someone who understood that closeness had to be earned again. "I keep thinking about everything," he said. "About how many times you must have felt alone." I did not answer right away, because the honest answer was too many times. I had felt alone at family dinners, alone in arguments, alone in rooms where my opinions were treated like background noise, alone while carrying work, home, emotional labor, and all the invisible responsibilities nobody wanted to name. So I told him the truth. I was lonely even when I was surrounded by people. He looked down. "That's on me," he said. "Yes," I replied. He took a breath. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I leaned back slightly. "You can ask." He hesitated, then said, "Did you ever regret marrying me?" That was a dangerous question. Not because it was unfair, because it was real. I looked at him for a long time before answering. "I regret the way I was treated after I married you," I said. I regret that your family taught me to shrink. I regret that you were too comfortable to notice. But I do not regret loving you." He exhaled, but I did not stop there. "Love is not the same as blind obedience, Daniel, and respect is not the same as endurance." He nodded slowly. "I understand that now." "No," I said quietly. "You understand it because you were forced to. Understanding would have looked different if you had chosen it earlier." He accepted that too, and for the first time, I saw something in him that I had not seen before. Not guilt, not fear, responsibility. That mattered more. The next morning, Margaret asked if she could speak to me alone. I almost said no. But then I decided that if I wanted peace in that house, I could not keep building walls forever. So I met her in the sunroom. She sat very straight in the chair opposite mine, hands folded tightly in her lap. For once, she did not look like a woman ready to judge me. She looked like a woman who had run out of armor. "Elena," she said, not meeting my eyes at first. "I owe you an apology." I waited. She swallowed. "I have spent most of my adult life believing that a woman's worth was measured by how well she served a home. I was raised to think ambition made women selfish, and I passed that thinking on without questioning it. That was the closest thing to a confession I had ever heard from her. She continued, "I thought if I kept the house in order, I was doing enough, but I see now that I used control where I should have offered support." I folded my hands in my lap, calm but alert. "And?" I asked softly. She looked at me then. "And I humiliated you." "Yes, that was the truth. Not a soft truth. A plain one." I nodded once. "Yes, you did." Her face tightened, but she did not argue. "I know," she said, "and I am sorry." I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "I accept your apology, but I need you to understand something." She listened carefully. "I do not want respect because you now know I have value. I want respect because I have always had value." Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. "I understand," she whispered. That conversation did not make us friends. It made us honest. And honesty is a stronger beginning than comfort ever was. That week, I decided to do something I had delayed for years. I opened an office outside the home, not because I needed to prove myself anymore, because I finally wanted my life to be visible. My team had grown. My company had grown. The work I had built in secret had outgrown the guest room and the late-night calls and the quiet hiding. So I leased a bright space in the business district, hired 2 more employees, and put my name on the glass door. The first time I stood outside that office with my key in hand, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind people use to dominate others. The kind that comes from surviving. The kind that says, "I built this with my own hands." I called Daniel that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. "I opened the office," I said. There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm proud of you." It was a simple sentence, but it hit me harder than I expected. Because this time, it sounded real. Not polished, not defensive. Real. Still, not everyone in the family changed. One cousin, the one who had laughed the loudest at dinner, kept slipping into the same old habits. At a family gathering a week later, he said, "So now Elena is the boss of us all?" The table went quiet. I turned to him and smiled politely. "No," I said. "I'm just no longer available for disrespect." That shut him up fast. The room was different now. Not perfect, but different. People listened before speaking. They watched how they addressed me. They no longer assumed my silence meant submission. And that alone felt like a victory. But the deepest victory came one evening, when I found Margaret in the kitchen looking at the recipe cards she had used for years. She glanced up when I walked in. "I used to think I was protecting this family by keeping everyone in their place," she said. I leaned against the counter and waited. "But all I really did," she said, "was make the house smaller." Her voice trembled just a little. That sentence stayed with me. Because that is what small thinking does. It makes large lives feel tiny. It turns love into a system of ranks. It makes a home into a hierarchy. And nobody thrives there. I nodded once. A home is not supposed to be smaller than the people living in it. She looked at me with a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude. No, she said, it isn't. After that, things did not become easy overnight. They became better in ways that mattered. Daniel started asking before deciding. Margaret started listening before judging. Richard started speaking to me like an equal instead of a dependent. And me? I stopped apologizing for every success. I stopped saying it was nothing when it was something. I stopped pretending that my work was a hobby just to make people comfortable. I became visible. And with that visibility came a different kind of peace. Not the peace of hiding. The peace of standing in the open and realizing the world did not end. One day, months later, I gave a keynote presentation for a business forum in Chicago. Daniel came. So did Margaret. So did Richard. They sat in the audience while I spoke about strategy, leadership, resilience, and women building businesses while carrying responsibilities that the world often refuses to see. I did not mention my family by name. I did not need to, because every word I spoke was part of the truth they had once tried to bury. At the end, the audience stood. Applause filled the room. I looked out and saw Daniel watching me with a face I will never forget. Not admiration alone. Not guilt alone. Something deeper. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had finally understood that the woman beside him had never been a shadow. She had been a force. After the event, he came up to me in the hallway. "You were incredible," he said. I gave him a tired but genuine smile. "Thank you." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you happy?" That question surprised me, because it was the first time he had asked about my heart instead of my performance. I thought about it carefully before answering. "I am becoming happy," I said. "That is different." He nodded, accepting the truth without trying to fix it. And that was enough, because healing is not a speech. It is a pattern. It is repeated respect, repeated honesty, repeated choice. If someone had told me years ago that I would have to hide my success just to survive my own marriage, I might have laughed. But that is how life works sometimes. The world does not always punish you for being weak. Sometimes it punishes you for being strong in the wrong room. Yet strength does not disappear just because others refuse to name it. It waits. It builds. It breathes quietly beneath the surface until the day it is needed. And when that day comes, it does not ask for permission. That is what happened to me. They thought I was just a housewife. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought the kitchen defined me. They thought the apron, the chores, the folded towels, and the quiet smile were the whole story. But they were only seeing the surface. They never saw the late nights, the strategy calls, the invoices, the contracts, the clients, the pressure, the risk, the discipline, the years I spent building something real while they were busy reducing me to something convenient. A year later, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt quiet, and not the kind of quiet that comes from fear. The kind that comes from peace. I used to walk through those hallways and feel every set of eyes on me, waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to prove their low expectations right. Now, when I walked through the same hallways, people stepped aside with respect. Not because I demanded it, because I had earned a different place in their minds. Margaret changed the most. Not overnight. Not in some dramatic movie way. Real change is slower than that. At first, she simply stopped making comments. Then, she started asking questions. Then, one afternoon, she sat beside me in the garden and said something I never thought I would hear from her. "I wish someone had told me sooner that a woman can be both a wife and a leader." I looked at her for a long moment, and I realized she was not asking for forgiveness anymore. She was asking to understand. That mattered. Because for women like us, understanding is often the first step toward healing. Richard changed too. He became a man who listened more than he spoke. That alone was a huge transformation. He began asking me for advice not only about the company, but about how to connect better with people in his own family. He once admitted, almost ashamedly, that he had spent so many years trying to look powerful that he had forgotten how to be wise. I did not laugh. I did not mock him. I simply told him the truth. Pride makes a man feel tall for a moment, but humility makes him last. He nodded like a student receiving a lesson he had needed for years. Daniel changed in a way that mattered most to me. Not because he became perfect, nobody does, but because he became present. He started showing up with honesty instead of excuses. He began treating my work like it was real, because he finally understood that it was. He stopped asking me to shrink to make others comfortable. And when his mother spoke carelessly, he corrected her. Not angrily, firmly. That was enough to tell me he had learned the difference between being a son and being a man. Still, the most powerful change was in me. Because once I stopped hiding, I started breathing differently. I took the bigger office space downtown. I hired more women. Women with degrees. Women with children. Women who had been told they were too much and not enough at the same time. I knew that feeling. So I made sure my company became a place where nobody had to apologize for being ambitious. We worked hard. We grew fast. And every time I watched one of my employees stand a little straighter because she finally felt seen, I remembered what it felt like to be dismissed in a dining room full of people who thought I was invisible. That memory never left me. It made me kinder. It made me stronger. It made me careful. Because power is dangerous when it turns cold. But success becomes beautiful when it helps others rise too. One evening, after a long day at the office, I came home late and found Daniel sitting in the living room with a small box in his hands. He stood up when I entered. "What is that?" I asked. He gave a small smile. "Something I should have given you a long time ago." I opened the box. Inside was a simple silver keychain with my company name engraved on it. No diamonds. No fancy speech. Just something quiet and thoughtful. I looked at him surprised. He said, "I wanted you to have a reminder that this life is yours too. Not just the house. Not just the marriage. Your work. Your name. Your space." I felt my throat tighten a little, because that was what I had always wanted. Not gifts. Recognition. Not praise. Respect. I closed the box gently and looked at him. "That means more than you know," I said. He nodded. "I know I can never undo what happened, but I can stop being the man who allowed it." That was the first time he spoke like someone truly accountable. And I believed him. Not because he said it beautifully, because he was living it. A few months after that, Harlow and Finch invited me to speak at a women's leadership event in New York. This time, I did not go as someone hiding behind a title. I went as myself. I stood on that stage in front of hundreds of women and told the truth. I told them that success is not always loud, that sometimes it begins in private, that some of the strongest women in the world are the ones who are doubted in their own homes. I told them that being called just a housewife can be one of the cruelest things a woman hears, because it ignores everything she carries, everything she knows, everything she has built. And then I said something I will never forget. A woman does not become valuable when the world notices her. She becomes visible when she stops hiding her value. The room went silent. Then it erupted in applause. I looked out at all those faces and thought about every night I had stayed up quietly, every time I had swallowed my frustration, every time I had let someone underestimate me because I was too busy becoming stronger. That was the moment I understood something important. My life had not been delayed by humiliation. It had been sharpened by it. Sometimes pain does not destroy you. Sometimes it forces you to become exact. That night when I came home, Margaret was awake in the kitchen. She had tea waiting for me. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She looked up and said, I watched the video of your speech. I sat down, across from her. She smiled faintly. You were very brave. I let out a small breath. I was just honest. No, she said. Brave women are usually honest women. The rest is just noise. I almost laughed at that. Almost. But then I saw something in her eyes that made me pause. Regret. Not the kind that wants attention. The kind that quietly stays with a person after they finally understand what they did wrong. She said, I think I spent too many years making myself small in order to keep a home together. I nodded slowly. And I think, I said, that made everyone else smaller too. She looked down at her tea. Yes, she whispered. It did. There was no anger between us then. Only truth. And sometimes truth is the only bridge strong enough to hold two people who were once on opposite sides. When people tell stories about women like me, they often want a dramatic ending. They want the cruel mother-in-law humiliated forever. They want the husband to beg and grovel. They want the arrogant family to collapse in one perfect scene. But real life is not always that neat. Real life is better than that, because real life gives us something more valuable than revenge. It gives us growth. It gives us dignity. It gives us the chance to become someone we can finally respect. And that was my ending. Not the moment they found out who I was, the moment I knew it myself, without needing anyone else to confirm it. I was not just a wife. I was not just a daughter-in-law. I was not just a woman who cooked dinner and folded laundry and kept the peace. I was a builder, a leader, a voice. A woman who had turned silence into strategy and pain into power. And no one in that house could ever take that from me again. So when I look back now, I do not remember the insults first. I remember the moment I stood in that conference room and watched their confidence fall apart. I remember the way my own hands stopped shaking. I remember how calm I felt when the truth was finally mine to speak. That calm was not weakness. That calm was victory. Because real strength is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is the woman sitting quietly at the end of the table, listening, building, waiting. And then, when the time is right, she stands up and changes everything. That was me. Then, just when I thought life had finally settled into something peaceful, another test came. It did not arrive with shouting. It did not arrive with insults. It arrived quietly. The way life often does before it changes everything. One morning, I got a call from my office manager. Her voice was careful. Elena, she said, there is something you need to see. I asked her what was wrong. She hesitated before answering. It is not wrong, she said. It is just unexpected. That answer made my stomach tighten, so I drove to the office myself. When I walked in, I saw my entire team standing near the conference room with expressions I did not like. Not fear, not panic. Concern. That was worse. My manager handed me a folder. Inside were documents, screenshots, and emails. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then I did. Someone had been trying to take credit for my work. Not from the family, from the business world. A former associate, a man I had once trusted during the early days of my company, had quietly been using my methods, my client structure, and pieces of my strategy in a separate venture. He had taken my ideas, twisted them, and tried to pass them off as his own. He had even gone so far as to imply that my success had only come because I had help from a wealthy family connection. When I saw that line, I did not feel hurt. I felt tired. Because no matter how far a woman rises, there will always be someone who wants to explain her success in a way that removes her effort. As if we are only impressive when someone else can be credited. As if our hard work belongs to everyone except us. I sat down in the conference room and read every page. Then I looked at my team and said, "Thank you for bringing this to me before reacting." My legal advisor was already on the line by the time I finished speaking. That afternoon, we sent formal notices. By evening, the story had changed. Not because I made a scene, Because the facts were on my side. The man who tried to steal from me learned what many people eventually learned too late. A woman who built something from nothing does not protect it with emotion alone. She protects it with evidence, with discipline, with precision, and with no apology. The issue was resolved within days. But something else happened because of it. The news spread, not in gossip circles, in business circles, and suddenly I was getting messages from other women. Women who had been overlooked, women who had been copied, women who had been dismissed, women who had worked twice as hard just to be named half as often. One message stayed with me. It said, "I thought I was the only one who had to prove myself in silence. Thank you for showing that quiet does not mean weak." I read that message twice. Then I sat back and closed my eyes. Because that was the real meaning of everything I had lived through. Not revenge, not status, not proving people wrong just for the thrill of it. The real meaning was this. Somewhere, another woman was watching my life and realizing she did not have to shrink to survive. That mattered more than applause. At home, Daniel noticed the shift in me. He saw that I was moving differently again, focused, sharp, a little heavier in the shoulders from the pressure. He asked me one night, "Are you okay?" I looked at him and answered honestly, "I am strong." "That is not the same thing." He nodded slowly. Then he sat beside me. "What do you need?" That question made me pause, because it was new. Not a demand, not a guess, a real question. "What do you need?" I thought about it carefully. Then I said, "I need a partner, not a witness." He absorbed that. Then he replied, "You have that now." I studied his face, and for the first time in a long time, I believed him without forcing myself to, because he had changed in the only way that really matters. He stopped wanting the easy version of me, the obedient version, the silent version. He started respecting the real one, not perfectly, but sincerely. And sincerity changes a marriage more than promises ever can. A few weeks later, Margaret invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. She had never done that before. We met at a quiet restaurant near the park, and for a while we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the garden, a neighbor's new puppy. Then she looked at me and said, "I have something to confess." I set down my glass. She continued, "When you first came into this family, I was afraid of you. That surprised me. I did not expect honesty like that." She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Not because you were rude. You never were. I was afraid because I could see that you had a self I did not understand. A woman who knows herself is hard to control." I did not interrupt. She looked down at her hands. "I thought if I kept you busy with domestic work, you would settle into a role I recognized." I let the silence stay between us for a few seconds. Then I said, "And did it work?" Her mouth tightened. "No," she said. "It only made me cruel." That was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied. "It did." She accepted that without arguing. Then she looked up at me with a kind of sadness I had never seen in her before. "I wish I had been wiser," she said. I answered gently, "It is not too late to be better." Her eyes filled, and in that moment, I realized something that had taken me years to understand. People do not always change because they are defeated. Sometimes they change because the truth finally leaves them no room to hide. And that too is a kind of victory. Months passed. The company grew. My team grew. My confidence, which had once been forced to live in secret, now had space to breathe. I began mentoring younger women in business. I did it quietly at first. One meeting, then another, then a whole series of sessions. Women who had been told they were too ambitious came to sit across from me and ask how I had done it, how I kept going, How I stayed calm when people belittled me. How I built something real while carrying so much invisible pressure. And every time, I told them the truth. I did not become strong because life was easy. I became strong because life gave me no choice. They would smile sadly when I said it, because they understood. That was the strange beauty of shared struggle. It creates recognition. It creates community. It creates a place where women no longer have to pretend they are the only ones surviving. At one of those mentoring sessions, a young woman asked me, "How did you stop caring what they thought?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I answered, "I did not stop caring overnight. I stopped letting their opinion define my reality." That answer seemed to stay with her. It stayed with me too. Because there is a difference between listening and obeying. A difference between being hurt and being ruled by hurt. A difference between love and permission. For too long, I had confused those things in my marriage. I had thought being a good wife meant making myself easier to carry. But a real marriage should not require one person to become smaller so the other can feel bigger. That is not love. That is imbalance dressed up as tradition. And once I saw that clearly, I could never unsee it. One evening, Daniel came home later than usual. He looked serious. I could tell something had happened. He sat down and said, "My father wants to sell the business." I blinked. "Sell it?" He nodded. "After everything, he says he is tired. He says the world changed and he did not change with it." He let that sink in. Then I asked, "And how do you feel?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I feel like he is finally admitting something I was too scared to say out loud," he replied. "That pride can ruin a family faster than failure can." I looked at him carefully. He looked back. Then he added, "I think I spent too long trying to look like a man who had it all together." My voice softened. "Most people do." He gave a short exhale. "But you," he said, "you never lied about who you were. I just never saw it." That sentence stayed with me, because that was the heartbreak of it all. Not that I had hidden my success, but that the people closest to me had been incapable of seeing it even when it was right in front of them. Sometimes the people who claim to know you best are the ones who have looked at you the least. Still, there was no bitterness in me anymore, only clarity. And clarity is freedom. A month later, Margaret surprised everyone again. At a family gathering, in front of relatives who had once treated me like background decoration, she raised her glass and said, "I want to say something about Elena." The room went still. I looked up from my seat, slightly wary. Margaret continued, "This family made a mistake. We judged her for being quiet. We assumed her kindness was weakness. We confused domestic work with a lack of intelligence." Nobody breathed. Then she looked directly at me. "Elena has more discipline, more strength, and more dignity than many people I know. She has reminded me that a woman's value is never reduced by the work she does at home, and never limited by the work she does outside it." For a moment, I could only stare at her. The relatives looked shocked. Daniel looked emotional, and I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not pride, not triumph, relief. Because sometimes the deepest wound is not the insult itself. It is the years it takes to be understood. After the gathering, Margaret came to stand beside me by the window. She did not say much. She did not need to. Then she asked quietly, "Did that help?" I thought about the question. Then I answered honestly, "It helped more than you know." She nodded. "I should have said it sooner." "Yes," I said, "you should have." She accepted that. Because truth does not always arrive in time. But when it arrives sincerely, it still matters. That night, after everyone had left, I stood alone in the garden for a while. The air was cool, the house was quiet, and for the first time, That quiet did not feel like judgment. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to belong to myself. I looked back at the windows of the house and remembered the woman I had been when I first entered it. Careful, silent, hopeful, wounded. That woman had not been weak. She had simply been carrying too much without help. And when people are carrying too much, they do not always break. Sometimes they become unrecognizable in their strength. I smiled to myself in the dark, because I knew now what I had become. Not just a wife, not just a daughter-in-law, not just a successful businesswoman. I had become a woman who knew her own worth even when the room refused to see it. And that is the kind of strength no one can take away. Not with disrespect, not with gossip, not with silence, not even with love. If that love is not honest. So yes, they thought I was just a housewife. They thought I belonged in the background. They thought my success was impossible because they had already decided my role. But I did not live by their script. I wrote my own. And when the final chapter came, I did not need to scream to be heard. Then came the moment I never expected. Not from my husband, not from his mother, not from his father, from the outside world. One afternoon, while I was in my office reviewing a client proposal, my assistant knocked on my door with an expression I could not read. "Elena," she said carefully, "there is a reporter here asking for you." I looked up from my desk. "A reporter?" She nodded. "She says she wants to write about women who built successful companies while being underestimated at home." For a second, I just sat there, because that headline felt too close to my life to be accidental. Still, I agreed to meet her. She was polite, professional, and direct. She asked about my company, my journey, my late nights, my early failures, my quiet years. And then she asked the question that made me pause. "Did your family know what you were building?" I looked down for a moment before answering. "At first, no," I said. "Later they found out, but by then they had already decided who they thought I was." The reporter leaned in slightly. "And how did that feel?" I thought about that for a long time. Then I said, "It felt like being invisible in my own life, but it also taught me something. If people can only respect the version of you they understand, then you have to become strong enough to survive their misunderstanding." She wrote that down. I did not know it then, but that interview would change everything, because a few weeks later the article was published. It was not sensational. It was not loud. It was honest. It told the story of a woman who was dismissed as just a housewife, while quietly leading a growing business, mentoring young women and helping companies expand across states. The article never named my family. It did not need to. Anyone who knew me understood. And once it was online, people began sharing it. Former clients, women in business groups, local leaders, college students, working mothers. People I had never met started sending messages. Some said they saw themselves in my story. Some said they cried while reading it. Some said they had been waiting for proof that they did not have to choose between home and ambition, between softness and strength, between being loved and being respected. That article traveled farther than I ever expected, and eventually, it reached my house. Of course it did. Margaret found it first. I was in the kitchen when she walked in holding her phone like it had burned her hand. "Elena," she said, "did you see this?" I looked at the screen and nodded once. "Yes." She stared at me, then at the article, then back at me. "Why didn't you tell us this was happening?" I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, "Because I did not build my life to entertain the people who doubted me." Her face changed. Not in anger, in understanding. That was one of the strangest parts of my life after the truth came out. The people who once mocked me now had to face the fact that I had never needed their approval to become successful. Later that evening, Daniel came home with the article folded in his hand. He looked tired.